Hi everyone, I'm Ryan. Hope you've had a good Unreal Fest so far. I mean, first day of talks and all that, so I'm sure you haven't seen too much. But today I'm here to talk about workflows and best practices and kind of getting started with Helix Core, as well as some of the things we ran across when going through Project Titan and just some oddities we saw and just overall trying to handle a project of that scope and all that. So just a quick bit about me. So I've been at Perforce for about 2 years, and I focus on the game and VFX and automotive side of things. And prior to that, I was in the VFX world as a pipeline dev, as well as in the automotive space. So for many, many years. So basically from 2013 to 2017, if you went online and configured a car, I probably touched it. Like, we did a lot of things. But as mentioned, today's agenda, we're going to go very quickly over what we saw with Project Titan and something of that scale. I will warn you that this is meant to be the nerdier, drier talk. So if you want to see the cool things and the art and all that, Aaron's talk is at 11:45 in Congress Hall 1. It's going to have a lot more art and a lot more good stuff. So beyond that, Helix Core and just Unreal Engine setup in general. So if you're brand new to things, how that kind of lays out, some of the things you want in place first before you start adding your data, and kind of getting things checked in. Some pitfalls to watch out for. Some of these things are from Project Titan. With a game jam of that size, it's always fun seeing how other people use softwares, because other people break things different than you do. So every time you teach something or work with a large group, you learn new ways in which things can get tripped. So beyond that, we did create some tools and some scripts for Project Titan that we've put up on our public GitHub page or on our personal GitHub pages. So if anyone wants these, feel free to take them, tear it apart, rebuild it, anything you want to do with it. It's not a big deal. It's free to use. And then finally, we'll end off with some new features and things that have been built in the last few revisions that might help out and just kind of change how you work a little bit. So, but to start off with Project Titan. So what was it? It was a global game jam that we talked about with Aaron Langmead, actually at last Unreal Fest. He just kind of wandered up to the booth and said, what would it be like if we had a global game jam where anyone could sign up, use the same Perforce servers, and could I please have 5,000 licenses to make that work? So we said, that sounds great, let's do it. So we got the licenses in place. They ended up setting up the island where people can go in, log in, submit all to the same server, and make that all work. So the island, and this is my one screenshot of Project Titan from this talk. Again, the cool stuff will be in Aaron's. And this was actually before any user art was added. This was the base state of everything. But it was 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers, so 64 square kilometers. It lasted 10 weeks. We had 4,100 registered users, of which we had about 1,600 that actively synced and polled. And then we had about 600 that were actively committing and making changes on a daily basis. So it was a very large project, and it was really fun to get to be a part of and work on. So at the end of everything, Project Titan was about 75 gigs on disk in your local workspace when you pulled everything down and had it there. And then all of our revisions up in the Helix Core server were about 350 gigabytes from everything that had been pushed. And over that 10-week period, we had about 17,000 change lists that came in from users all over. So if you were part of it, thank you. It was a lot of fun to do. So for the server specs and how we spun everything up and everything. So initially, we were trying to make this as easy for the teams within Epic and AWS and Perforce to manage and build all that out. So initially, we spun up a very small server. And that lasted about a week, I think, before we started to top out on everything that was available. It was intentionally just built out for the initial pushes of Aaron and Sebastian and Sam. So it was very, very small. It was a C5 large instance on AWS, which is, 2 virtual CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM, and very cheap to run. Storage-wise, about 50 gigs on the root volume, 50 gigs on the log volume, 80 gigs on the metadata, which we had started at 50 and then slowly expanded that as we saw usage grow up. And we didn't want to play around with the actual archive data, so we just made HXDepot a terabyte and let it ride, and just kept it that way. So after about a week, as I mentioned, we were adding users in batches of about 800. So I think once we got to about the second batch, or 1,600 users, that's when our tiny little main commit servers started running into some issues, and commands started stacking up. And very quickly, we just jumped over to an M5 2x large. So we gave it 8 vCPUs, 32 gigs of RAM, and that instance actually ran for the majority of the game jam. I think it was the last 2 or 3 weeks we expanded it further. But the only reason we expanded it is that we saw that in monitoring, a couple of the peaks, and particularly of RAM usage, our peaks were right at that 32 gig, slightly over amount. So we were trying to make sure it wasn't going to page file. We wanted to make sure everything ran quick. And also we knew as the game jam went to end, we were going to have a lot of users that were getting final commits in at the last minute and lots of changes. So we expected a ramp in activity. So we just pushed it a bit larger. So we went 16 vCPUs and 64 gigs of RAM, and that ran for the remainder of the game jam. So as far as beyond the actual commit server, since this was a global game jam, our main commit server was in London, and we knew that not everyone in every region is going to have great rewrite capabilities and bandwidth to London. So to try and make things easy, we ended up spinning up 3 other proxy servers, knowing that we're going to have that many or 4,000 possible users and all of that. We weren't too concerned that these proxy servers were ever going to be too far out of date because people are going to be pulling pretty consistently, so the data on them was going to stay fresh. And proxies are the easiest way to set up that sort of local regional access. So we spun up 3, 1 in the Asia region in Seoul, Korea, and then 2 in the US. So 1 in Virginia and 1 in California to kind of handle those 2 sides of things. With that, proxies are very fast to spin up. You don't have to change anything on your commit server to make them work. So for quick expansion in that style, highly recommend them. And for quick proxy setup as well, we actually use the server deployment package for both the commit server and the proxies. And so that's what that QR code is there. It's essentially our professional services team way of how they prefer to deploy Helix Core. So it sets up a lot of best practices, tracking, and it also gets monitoring in place. So if you end up wanting to connect to a Grafana server and monitor, it's already there. So, and then the last note is just that the proxy instances were tiny. They were still that initial setup of 2 vCPUs, 8 gigabytes of RAM, and we never really had any issue with them. They just ran happily. So as mentioned in the SDP, it has some ability to monitor your instances, and it does that through Prometheus, which is a monitoring framework that you can export out your data to a Grafana dashboard and have essentially real-time or up-to-date tracking on your instances. And so here, this is just a view of the server, and this was in that final configuration of 16 vCPUs and 64 gigs of RAM. And so we can see that on our CPU, we're not stressed at all. Like we're barely pinging 25% there as far as CPU usage. So that was perfect. RAM stayed right around where our peaks were, about right at that 32 gig mark. And that's why we expanded up. Overall, server load was all right, wasn't bad. And then in the bottom level, and this is the one that I find most useful, is tracking your storage on your disk. So these are all percentage based, so you kind of do have to know what each volume has available to it. But you can see that you can very quickly tell where things are. And also, you'll notice that we've got on the orange line, which is our metadata, that it kind of dips down at one point. And that was an expansion point where we knew we were coming up to the end of the game jam. We didn't want to run into any issues or anything. So we expanded it from 60 gigs to 80 gigs, and the percentage dropped pretty heavily. So it's really great and pretty useful to use Prometheus in this way. Beyond the actual CPU resource marks and all that, you can also get a dashboard that will show you specifically about your Helix core server. So number of commands that are coming in, the burn rate, making sure those commands are dropping down to 0 and not getting queued up, what types of commands are coming in, adds, deletes, that sort of thing. And so I highly recommend setting this up because you can also use that to send out notifications, particularly on your disk size. If that gets too close, the server will stop accepting commands and it feels like everything's on fire, but it's not. It's just keeping itself safe. So as far as setting up Helix Core and getting it running with Unreal Engine kind of for the first time and all that, there's some things you definitely want to have in place before you start to throw your Unreal data in. So to start, one thing that you really want to put in place is an up-to-date type map. And so a type map, what it is on your Helix Core server, it's a way to establish paths and basically patterns of file types and how the server should treat them. So you can see in this example that we've got a lot of files that are basically just text. And text files are handled a little bit differently, where you're allowed to actually go line by line and merge, and multiple people can check them out in this kind of configuration, which for text files or code, no problem. All day, you can let multiple people work on it, merge things as you go, and at the end of the day, you have a final product that's usable and parsable and good. But when it comes to binary files and your UAsset files and all that, you can't really do that. And so it's important to put in file locking prior. And that would be, it's not represented in this example, but it would be binary plus capital L, or binary plus L, lowercase. And what that'll do is it'll make it an exclusive checkout file. So if anyone is working on that file, it locks it on the server and no one else is allowed to check it out at the same time. And the intention there is to avoid those merge conflicts, because with binary files, you can't go line by line. And so if you run into a merge conflict, you just have to decide who has to redo their work today. And that's not a good thing inside a studio. You don't want to sow that kind of discord and anger. So it's better to lock it. And then if anyone needs to check it out, in P4V, it'll tell you who has it checked out in what workspace, and then you can Slack them and get angry before anyone has to redo their work. So with that, these are server-wide settings. So if you do have specific projects where you want certain files to be treated differently, you just define that in the path. So you can see here that in the file paths, we've got the // which essentially means the root of the server. And then following that, there are 3 dots, which that ellipses is Helix Core syntax for a recursive wildcard, and then followed by a file extension, so .exe in this instance. If you need to do subdirectories or, again, have different handling for different projects, you can extend that path out as far as you need, and it will respond to each in turn. The QR code here is, we do have a type map template that we like to use and recommend. And we've set this one up for Unreal Engine, Unity, and Godot, which I hope I don't get in trouble for mentioning those here. But it's basically just our universal one that, hey, no matter what you're developing in, grab this type map, put it in place, and you should have a good base to start and make sure that your UAssets are binary and locking format, and you can get running pretty quick without having any issues. So, but what if I started adding data to my Helix Core server before I had my type map defined? So you can at any point edit this type map and change how the server behaves with files, but it will only change how it behaves from that point on. So any new assets that match that pattern will get the new type. It doesn't change file types for anything that's already existing in place, which can leave you in a bit of a lurch or a weird spot where any old files are binary and any new ones are binary plus L, and we really want to make sure that they're plus L. You can use the P4 retype command in a command line to fix any file types that you need to on the server. And so at the bottom there, we've just got a quick example where I retyped any EU asset I had on my local server into a binary plus L, and you'll see that that final output just says, hey, it was binary, now it's binary plus L. One note about this is this does change how things are categorized on the server, but if someone already has a workspace checked out, it doesn't change the file type in their personal workspace. So as an admin, if you do this, send an announcement, say, hey, please clean up your workspace and resync so you can get the latest file with the correct file type. And that way, that binary lock will go into place and all that. So a couple of other things. Ignoring files is very important as well, particularly with Unreal. You've got a few folders that you definitely don't want to check into your Helix core repository because they're either specific to your user or they just add a lot of noise. And these files are going to change a lot in these folders. And it's going to look like a lot of work and changes have been being done, but it's not really relevant to everyone. So the big three that you typically want to exclude from checking into your revision control are going to be your save directory, your intermediate, and your derived data cache. Excluding those, you can then build anything you need or run your game or check everything in, and you're only getting your actual changes in the work from folks that you need to. So there's a few different ways of ignoring files in Helix core. This one's pretty much the most common of using a P4 ignore, and if you've used Git or anything like that, you're pretty used to that style of syntax and defining it all out in a file and then running it. There are some pros and cons to this style. One is that the pro is that the processing takes place client-side. So when you actually, in P4V, say, hey, I'd like to submit my workspace or mark for add or anything like that, it's actually your machine that's doing that processing and filtering it out before it goes to the server. So there's no undue server load. We can use everyone's individual machine to figure that out. So as much as a plus as that is, it can also be a negative if someone who doesn't really know what they're doing deletes that P4 ignore file on their local machine, because the client now doesn't know that that file exists, won't use it, and then they could still technically push things in the server that you don't want them to. So it can be edited, deleted by a user. Make sure you protect it in the your protections table, your permissions table, to only admins can make edits to this file and things of that nature. But it just leaves a little bit of a gap for mishaps. So, and this QR code is just an example, P4 ignore, in that style for Unreal if you wanted to pick that up and use it. And then the other style of ignoring files is in the stream spec. So if you're using a streams depot, you can actually define these ignore files on the server side. And so again, positives and negatives to each thing. With this one, you get server-side processing, which can be nice for an admin because before anyone touches the server, you can define this ignore those files and folders, and then you can lock down your stream spec so no one else can edit it, and then you can sleep easy that no one's going to screw things up when you step away from the computer for a moment. So I like it from that side, just that admin control aspect. But the one other thing is that since it is being processed server side, its use is a little more limited in the sense that when it comes to those recursive wildcards, you're only allowed to add them at the beginning and end of your pattern or your file path. So in the P4 ignore, you can get as wild as you want. You can have wildcards in the middle of paths and anything like that. This one, if you try to do that, it's going to tell you, hey, that's a bit too deep for me. I'm not going to let it happen. So you can use these in conjunction with each other too. So if you wanted to, as an admin, you could define the core, I absolutely want these things protected in your P4 stream spec, and then use the P4 ignore for any things that you want to add additionally or anything that's a little more complicated, but just knowing that you have that double layer of protection there. So, and then the one other note is that it is slightly a different syntax than the P4 ignore style. And this QR code is an example, or our example for Unreal, for a stream spec ignore style. So you can copy this and use it and all that. A couple other things. Permissions and setting up your file protections, very important. Please do it. Make sure everything's good. Because By default, when you install Helix Core, it's going to be put into place where every user that logs into the server has access to every file that's on the server. So the one big permissions line you're going to get is going to say write user asterisk asterisk and then just // ... So just saying any user from any host has access to everything. I prefer to do things a bit more discreetly and intentionally on that side of things. So I would recommend taking that from write to no access. So any user that comes to the server that doesn't have any permissions applied to them specifically doesn't see anything at all. And at that point, I typically like to do groups. So I would build out user groups on a per project basis. So perhaps one that's project A read access, project A write access, and assign my users as I need to those groups, and then put those groups in my permissions table with the write access or read access in the specific order. So with the permissions table, you have a lot of control too, as far as what people can touch. With something like Git, it's essentially if you have access to the repo, you have access to absolutely everything. But with Helix Core, we let you apply specific permissions to subfolders, subfiles. You could even use the wildcard and lock people down to specific file extensions if you needed to. So you have full control over what people can see and what they can control and read and write and all that. So, and then to bounce back to Project Titan a bit, here's how we set up our main permissions table for that. Since again, there's 4,000 users, there's a lot of possibility for error or people doing things to the server, whether it was malicious or not, just making sure that no one person accidentally ruins the game jam and makes it so no one can read and write and do all that. So here you can see that we ended up creating a Titan Art user group. And the first thing we do with the Titan Art group is we go ahead and mark that they have blanket read access to the Project Titan main line. So that main line, they can do anything they want within, or they can't do anything they want. They can read and copy those assets down, but they can't write to anywhere yet. Then the next block of permissions, we assign write access to very specific folders in the content folder. So that way, when people are working, they're able to create their assets, upload them, put them in these content folders, but not create new directories, not add new areas or anything like that. It was very specific little bubbles that we were letting them write their content back to. And then underneath that, we actually went further, and everything in red there, those are no open commands. So they're actually, like, instead of granting permissions, they're removing permissions on specific files. And we went through and disallowed editing for the UMaps, so that way no one could just delete Titan main and make it so no one could access the project. And since we were using external actors, we actually, this permissions table goes out about 1,000 lines, and there were specific external actors that we didn't want anyone to touch. So we just went line by line, file by file, and defined that out. So you can do that through the P4 admin tool like this. But obviously for thousands of files, that's not going to be fun to make that style of edit on a cell by cell level. So you can actually export this out as a text document, make all the edits you need to, do something programmatic, and then put it back in a text format, and it'll read it in and redraw it out. So that's how we kind of built that one out. And then this is another final one here, but it's very, very important, is make sure you've got checkpoints and backups running on your server. The default package install, if you use Linux package install or you just download the Windows or Mac installer, isn't going to set up any daily checkpoints for you. But if you use that SDP and that software or server deployment package, it will put those sort of checkpoints and daily checkpoints in place. So what a checkpoint is effectively a fancy zip file that's going to take all your metadata tables and your database tables and everything in your server at that moment, copy everything to or rotate your journal, copy all of those, define them, and then zip them up and move them to the side. So if your server ever blows up, if you've got that checkpoint file, you can rewrite all the records of what you've done pretty quickly and get your server back up and running. What a checkpoint file doesn't do, though, is it's not actually storing your revision files. So all of your actual work, all of the binary files, all of that, it's not backing up that drive. This is just about the tracking of those files. So typically what I see folks do is they'll set up a cron job to do nightly checkpoints, or however often they prefer to do a checkpoint, and then write that checkpoint file to their HX depot or their HX archive, which is where you're storing all of your revision data, and then taking a snapshot of that drive and storing it elsewhere. So that way, as you've got your maybe nightly AWS snapshots running, you've got a checkpoint that's already in place. And so if you ever need to, you can restore that, replay that checkpoint, and keep going and making sure you're not losing too much. So, but definitely something you want in place before you know you need it, because finding out that, oh, the server actually went down and our last checkpoint was 6 months ago is a terrible feeling, and I don't wish that on any of you. So, if you want any more information on any of this and all that, we do have a few YouTube playlists and all that. So we've got one that's based for beginning users. So if you have a team member that's brand new to Perforce and whatnot, you can point them there, find out what revision control is, how to use it, how to work with Perforce. And then we have another playlist that's more focused on admins of, again, setting up your permissions, setting up your ignores, doing all that, getting your checkpoints, expanding storage on AWS and DigitalOcean and those sorts of things. Let us know if there's anything else you'd like in this list, because it's basically me and another SE that whenever we get recommendations of like, hey, I'd love to have a video that says this, we go and record it and toss it up there. So yeah, happy to hear whatever you guys need. So some weird pitfalls that we ran into with Project Titan. And again, people break things in different ways than you break things, which is great because you learn how to fix them and all that. So one that we had kind of right out of the gate is we were trying to make things as easy as possible for folks to set up their workspaces, get running, download the data, and start to build things out. And so we ended up using in P4V and Helix Core, you can set up a default workspace template. And so we defined all that in a template. So whenever they made a new workspace, it would point them to the right area, fill out their workspace spec as we expected. However, by design, that template doesn't actually fill out that streams field, which left us in a pretty strange spot, because with that workspace mapping, if you made it correct or used the template and that stream field wasn't filled out, it would let you sync everything down to your local machine. You could open it up. You could start checking files out. You could work. You could make changes. But when you went to go submit back, the server would say, you're trying to submit from a non-streams workspace into a stream depot. I'm not going to let you. So it was scary for folks very quickly because they were like, I just did a bunch of work. I can't submit it back to the server. What's going on? And really, it was just about adding the stream declaration to their workspace to get everything working again. So the first fix we had was Discord messages, big announcements. Hey, check your workspace. If this isn't there, put it in place. That worked a little. Like, a lot of people don't read documentation. It just happens that way. So we went a little bit further, and I actually just wrote a script that would scrape every workspace on the server that had Titan main in it, look for that streams attribute, and if it wasn't there, I would put it in place for them. So I just ran a cron job off of my local machine that would repair any new workspaces hourly. And that took care of it. Because again, documentation is nice if anyone actually opens it up. And if not, you're going to end up answering that same question over and over again. So. Another strange one that we came across with one particular user was they were using external drive with their Mac to host their workspace. And particularly this external drive was in exFAT format. So it would let them create their workspace. They would sync everything down initially. Everything looked great. They started working, making changes. But if they ever tried to sync again, it would tell them, hey, all of your files have been edited. I don't want to clobber your local changes, and it wouldn't do a second sync. And so they were just left in this spot where it was constantly identifying every file as being edited, which wasn't true. And it took a while for us to figure this out through Discord because you can only see so much. And it really came down to on the Mac with an exFAT drive, it wasn't marking those files read-only when it's being downloaded into their workspace. So without that permission being flipped, where typically in Helix Core, your workspace comes down, everything's read-only, and then when you check a file out, it becomes read-write, and that's how it can track if things have been edited or any of that. Without that, everything was left in read-write mode, and that's why it was seeing everything as possibly being edited and creating this clobber issue. So unfortunately, there wasn't a clean fix for this with the volume as it was. So the user actually just backed up their workspace somewhere else. This drive was pretty empty, so they weren't too concerned. They just reformatted it in a proper format that OS X could handle and mark those read-only bits, and then put their workspace back and then continued on. But if you ever kind of see this sort of instance, that's likely what's going on. But it's going to look really scary at first because, again, in their dashboard, in their log, they're going to get, in this instance, 219 warnings about how they couldn't clobber files and spook them. So, this one goes back to the actual storage drives and the space and everything that's involved with that. So with Helix Core, there are storage size limits and safety limits. And basically, if your drive gets too full, the server is going to say, hey, I don't know if the next command you're going to run is going to be larger than the drive can handle. So I'm going to just stop accepting commands and tell you that, hey, you need to expand your drive. However, for typical productions, anytime a server stops accepting commands, it feels like, again, it's on fire. The world is terrible. I've got a team that needs to work. Why am I experiencing this type of thing? So it is a safety limit, and it can be changed and edited. And on the left here, I've got the actual server configurable commands you can change and all that. By default, they're going to be set to 250 megabytes, I believe is what it says. I believe the SDP sets those up a bit farther, so I think it's at 5 gigs. I show you these not to say, well, let's just set them to 0. Let's go ahead, give me that space back. But instead, just to know that they're here, and you can set them as you need. What I think is a better solution here is instead of relying on these to let you know when it's time to expand everything, you could actually, through P4 Prometheus and Grafana, you can set up warnings again of like, hey, if my server's 75% full, let me know, send me an email before I get to that limit. That limit is there to allow the system to keep running in the meantime while your admin goes in and makes changes, deletes log files, that sort of thing. So we did run into this with Project Titan, specifically with the logs directory. It was filling up very fast. So one thing we actually did for that is, first thing we did was expand that log drive. So we gave it another 20 gigs or whatnot. And then we also set up a quick cron job to just nightly check to see if any logs were older than a week old. And if they're over a week old, if anything were to happen, we're probably not going to be looking for data out of that. So we just went and anything that was older than a week, we would delete. So you could change that. You could copy them somewhere else, do whatever you need to. But we decided to just kind of toss them out and give it that. So, and one last thing to watch out for, and this was a pitfall, and yeah, I can say this is probably the most controversial slide in the deck, is case sensitivity on your server. By default, if you set up a Linux server, it's going to be case sensitive. So if you have a file path that's all lowercase and a file path that's all uppercase, Linux is going to see those as 2 separate file paths. Windows doesn't. It puts you in a spot where when you commit something from Windows or pull things down, it can cause issues because it doesn't think it's different, but the history is being written in 2 different spots. So if you're using Helix Core specifically with Unreal, specifically only with Windows clients and all that, you probably would want to set that up as a case-insensitive server, and also likely leave Unicode mode off if you don't need Unicode mode. But as SEs, we typically end up recommending that you leave it as a case-sensitive server and then putting a case check trigger, which is just a Python script that runs on submit to check cases for you. The only reason we do that is because Helix Core can be used for many projects, many different things. You may be housing Unreal projects. You may have various code scripts that are being written and all that. And you want to make sure that those file cases are exactly as they're stated. So that way imports and whatnot don't fail. If you have files that are relying on one another where it works on my Windows machine, but once I go load it to the Linux server, it fails because Linux isn't finding it and all that. So we typically recommend keeping it case sensitive and then adding that case check trigger. But again, if you're using it for only Unreal projects and all that, and only Windows machines, go ahead and make it case insensitive and have a good time. So with that, we have made some tools and some scripts that we created because, again, if we're running a game jam with 4,000 users, there's going to be lots of requests that pop up time and time again. And we had a team of about three admins on the Epic side, 2 admins on the Perforce side, and 4,000 users. So didn't matter what time of day you logged in, you could probably find a couple requests that you need to handle. So one that came in really useful was an easy password reset tool. So in P4 admin, these are just custom scripts that you can go ahead and add as a custom tool. So it'll show up in a right-click menu if you highlight a user or things of that nature. Basically, this tool would just, if you right-click on a user, normally you would see change password. And when you click that change password, it's going to just give you a prompt so you can type something in. And when you have changed 20 passwords in a day, you stop feeling very creative and you don't want to come up with some new little cute thing to change. So we just made this script that would just very quickly just give us a general hash for a password and then also require password change on next login. So that way we were essentially generating a one-time use password and then passing that on to the user through Discord. The QR code here is a link to download it if you want to use it or change it or the source code for it. I would probably recommend, if you're running this within a studio, edit this code slightly so that way it would just send an email to the registered email on the user. For Titan, it was a little different because we wanted to mask emails. So we actually cleared all those out and put a single email address for everyone. So that wouldn't have worked on our side. So we had to rely on Discord and someone contacting us, and then we would just hand it out and make our lives simple on that side. And then on this page, it's just the when you're editing a local tool or adding a custom tool, that is the setup that I used. So the application, just write to the exe, and then you can pass in arguments. And in this one, it's just %u for user. And then there's one other thing in there. Typically, it's up at the top, the add application to add to applicable context menus. And because it uses a user argument, that would then add this to the right-click menu for any user. So that way we didn't have to go to the menu to do it. Also, we had a force unlock tool. Again, with lots of users, there's lots of locking of files. And if someone locks a file, leaves for vacation, it can leave you in a really funny spot. And you have to contact an admin to typically unlock things. So you can normally unlock if you're an admin through the command line, but no one has time for that. Let's go ahead and make this a lot easier. So this tool would just make it so anyone who has admin access, you could just highlight a locked file, right-click, and say force unlock. And it would just quickly do the lookup for you. So it would find out who has it locked, in what workspace, so that way you could do a force revert on the server for that file. So this one was a pretty nice one. As you can see in the output in the bottom there, it's going to say, hey, I found one exclusive checkout file to unlock. I haven't done it yet, but if you hit enter, I will. And you can then force that unlock. So that's a good one. And again, this one's up on Jace's GitHub, so you can download it, use it, pull it, all that. Well, let's say, again, this can work for small teams and all that, but let's say you wanted something a little bit more dangerous and be a little more wild. So we did also write an automatic timeout revert script. And this one, it's a very sharp sword, so be warned if you use it. But effectively what this does is this checks, I set this up as a cron job, and it would check hourly how long things have been checked out exclusively. And so when it first sees a file, it registers that first time, and then after a set amount of time, it would force revert that file on the server. And for Project Titan, this was absolutely essential because, again, 4,000 users, people could very quickly lock up everything and then just leave it in a lock state and no one could progress. Within a studio, I think this tool needs a few more safety measures before I would implement it on a studio side of things. For one, I would extend that time frame out from, it was decided it was 24 hours was our unlock time. I would probably go with 7 days or 5 days or something along those lines. And the other thing I would build into this tool for use in a studio would be just some warnings. So beyond just an unlock time limit, I would probably put in a warning notification time limit. So like at 3 days, hey, you've had this file checked out for 3 days. Are you still working on it? In 2 more days, it's going to force revert type of thing. Again, with Project Titan, we didn't have email addresses, so that's not something we could have sent out. So we just kind of had to say, hey, don't check things out for longer for a day. Otherwise, it's going to get hit with a hammer, and it's going to cause you some issues. So it did cause issues in Project Titan, but again, it was one of those things where we had to occasionally deal with reconciles that were coming through because of force unlock, but also if we didn't do that, the server would have been checked out indefinitely very quickly. So, but again, there's the QR code if you end up wanting to use this or have a need for it with contractors or anything like that. A little bit of a format there, but one other quick one was just an auto create p4 config file. So p4 config file lets you define out your environment variables per workspace. So that way, if you're hopping into your terminal or anything very quickly, it'll overwrite what you have available from your environment variables for your system as a total. As someone who bounces between servers quite often, I like to define a p4 config for every workspace. So that way, if I'm on a command line, it'll always pick up the right values. But yeah, it's a very small script. You can, again, download it, change it, do whatever you want with it. But it's just something that I always typically click anytime I'm in P4V. So I just have my character set, my ignore location, my client set up, so I can jump in there quickly. And then one more big tool here that we built out, I built this recently, is a P4 project template tool. So the intention here is that if you're a team that has a lot of small form features, let's say you work, with this one I was thinking back to my time at Method Studios where we did a lot of commercials. So every couple of weeks we'd be spinning up a new project. And we would have a set form for how that all needs to lay down. With that, this project template tool effectively allows you to define a JSON file that allows for curly brace syntax for variables to be passed in, and it can build out depots, streams, users, groups, add lines to your permission table, edit your type map, and also branch. If you have a template project already created, you could branch that into your new project very quickly. So if you're a studio that's spinning things up quite often, this could be used to build things out very quickly and allow you to kind of just define those template spots that you need to make for each new one, run it, and do all that. On this slide, I'm just showing the actual JSON format. It does have a UI for both the launcher and the editor. So whichever you prefer, if you prefer to hop in and write it in JSON, you can. If you're someone who likes a graphical interface, you can do that too. So I'm going to quickly talk on some new features here. We're probably going to run a bit long, so we might not have much of a QA session here, but I am right at the table out that way. So if anyone has any questions, stop on by and say hi. But here are some new features that have come out in the last few revisions that might help you out, and I recommend for various things. So starting from the top, there's virtual file sync, and this is for Windows clients. And effectively, this is to make your initial syncs go much quicker. So normally, if you're not using a virtual file sync, when you sync your files down, it's going to copy all your metadata to your workspace and then copy all those files immediately to your system. With a virtual file service, it will instead just copy the metadata to your service and then put stubs in your local workspace. Now, when you go to open one of those files, it will then download that file at that time. So it's kind of a deferred download. For Unreal, I can't say this is that great because as soon as you open Unreal, it's going to download absolutely everything. So might as well do that first. But if you're using a workspace for DCC files or Maya files or anything like that, you can open up one specifically and it will only pull the dependencies it needs for that one file. So it can be pretty useful for artists in that case. Also in that same release, we've got some system resource monitoring added. This essentially will check the server pressure, as it's called. And so whether it comes to your RAM or your CPU, you can set up limits on how much you want that to be used. And it doesn't notify you or warn you, but what it will do is when commands come in and it starts getting close to that server pressure limit, it will send them to a queue instead and start to queue up commands. So that way the server can then chew through them and hopefully not reach a point where the command queue is just continually growing. If it does, there is another configurable that says, hey, your command queue has 5,000 commands in it. I'm going to stop receiving commands now, and it'll warn you in your logs. But the entire intention is to make sure your server just doesn't hard crash when you run out of memory. A big one in these next three are in our latest release in May. Sparse streams. So essentially, sparse streams are a faster way to branch with Helix Core. Normally, if you were to create a development or a release stream, it would immediately start replicating all the metadata and branch those files over into that, which can take some time if you have a particularly large branch. Sparse streams instead are almost like an import, and then when you make an edit to a specific file, it will at that time branch the file and create the metadata. So you can make streams very, very quickly. And with that being generated quickly, you can also use that for release streams and all that. So essentially, if you are someone who likes to work in kind of a task style or create a branch per feature or bug, you can very quickly create a branch, start to make edits, make changes. The only metadata that's stored on the server is only the files you've changed, and then you can upload that back to your main line. Number 4 is S3 and S3 compatible object storage support. So in 23.1, we put this in place for archive depots. So if you had projects that you were done with and you wanted to kind of save on your cloud storage, you could take archives and move them over to S3 buckets or even Glacier buckets and still have them represented in Helix Core. With the latest release, we've expanded that out to every depot type. So if you are a smaller studio or looking to just cost optimize storage on certain depots, you can set those up in S3 buckets now, which are far cheaper than your typical block storage for your cloud providers. And then the last one is the first half of a feature, is how I kind of refer to it, and it's Delta submits. And so what that is for uncompressed binary files, after you do an initial upload, it will create a map of that binary file. And when you make changes, if I make a small change, instead of uploading that entire file, it's going to only upload the portions of the binary code that has changed and then reconstitute the file on the server. So it should make your submits a lot faster for large files when you have small changes. So test that one out. And the reason I say it's half a feature is because right now it's only for submits. Later on this year, we are going to expand that out to syncs as well. So that should also help for your sync times when you've got changes on large files, as well as hopefully egress costs if you are hosting on the cloud. So, but yep, with that, just if you haven't used Helix Core and this talk has made you interested or anything like that, here are the download links for both Helix Core, or if you don't want to have any of the admin rights or admin issues, we do offer Helix Core Cloud, which is just our software as a service offering. We're for $39 a user a month, you can sign up and get rolling very quickly. So as mentioned, I've used all the time, so I apologize there won't be a QA here, but I'm just out in front of the bar. So with that, come say hi and grab a bee. But thank you.